She called me a burden in front of everyone I'd ever loved. Then she had me escorted out of my own retirement party, like a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. I still remember the exact moment. The hall at the Bowral RSL Club was packed, maybe 180 people. Colleagues from 32 years at the Department of Infrastructure, neighbors from our street in Moss Vale, my brother Dennis flying in from Cairns, old mates I hadn't seen since before my wife Margaret passed. The ceiling fans were turning slowly overhead. Someone had hung a banner that read, "Congratulations, Dad 65 and still standing." My son had organized it all. Or so I thought. I was standing near the entrance talking to my old supervisor, Ron Kearney, when my son's wife, I'll call her Diane, walked over with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Gently, the way you touch someone when you're about to say something that isn't gentle at all. "Dad," she said, loud enough for the three people nearest to us to hear. "We need to talk about something." I excused myself from Ron and followed her to the side of the room, near the bar. That's when my son, Thomas, who I'd raised alone after Margaret died of breast cancer when he was 19, walked over and stood beside his wife. He wasn't smiling. "We've had a few people mention they're concerned," Thomas said. "About your memory. About whether you're still on top of things." I looked at him. "What are you talking about?" "The electricity bill," Diane said. "You told us you'd paid it 3 times. You forgot you'd already called the repairman. You left the stove on twice last month." "I left the stove on once," I said. "And I was right there in the kitchen." "Dad." Thomas lowered his voice, but there was something rehearsed about it, something flat. "We've spoken to a solicitor, just to understand your options. We think it might be time to talk about a power of attorney arrangement. For your protection." 2. I felt the room tilt slightly. Around us, conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed loudly near the birthday cake. And I was standing in the middle of it all, being told that my son had already been to see a solicitor about my affairs. At my own retirement party. "I'm 65, I said. "Not 105. "That's exactly the attitude that worries us," Diane said. I looked at her then. Really looked. She was 41, neat and composed in a navy dress, and her expression was one of practiced concern, the kind you might rehearse in a mirror. I had never been unkind to this woman. I had attended every birthday, every Christmas, every school concert for their 2 children. I had lent Thomas money twice, once when their mortgage rate jumped, and once when Diane's car needed replacing. I had never once asked for it back. "I think," I said carefully, "this is a conversation we should have in private." "We've been trying to have it in private," Thomas said. "You keep changing the subject, Thomas." I stepped closer to him, away from the nearest guests. "What is actually going on here?" He looked at Diane. She gave him the smallest nod. "We think you should move into something more manageable," he said. "The house is too big for one person. The garden alone is. The house is paid off," I said. "It has been for 11 years. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Diane put a hand on Thomas's arm. "The point, Dad, is that we're worried about you rattling around in that big place alone. And we think selling it and moving somewhere with proper support makes sense. For everyone. For everyone." There. It was. I took a breath. I was aware of Dennis watching from across the room. I was aware of Ron Kearney pretending not to watch. I was aware of about a dozen other people who had gone very quiet in our general direction. "I'm not selling my house," I said. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Dad, don't be. I am not selling my house, Thomas. Not tonight. Not because your wife thinks it makes sense for everyone, and not without a conversation that doesn't happen in the middle of my retirement party." Diane's composure cracked, just slightly. A muscle moved in her cheek. "You're being embarrassing." And her voice had changed. The practiced gentleness was gone. Am I? You're making a scene. Everyone's watching. You're acting like a stubborn old man who can't accept help. Diane Thomas started, but she wasn't finished. We have been patient, Dad. We have been so patient. We've put up with the calls at odd hours, the same stories repeated, the confusion. You are 65 years old, and you cannot manage your own affairs, and you need to accept that and stop being so proud about it. Her voice had risen. Several conversations nearby had stopped altogether. I looked at my son. He said nothing. Thomas, I said. Look at me. He looked up. Is this what you think? A pause. Long enough to answer the question. Without a word. We just think it's best. He said, quietly. I nodded. I picked up my jacket from the back of a nearby chair. I shook Dennis's hand on the way past. He'd crossed the room, and his expression told me he'd heard enough. I said goodnight to Ron Kearney. I walked out through the double doors of the Bowral RSL Club into a cool Southern Highlands evening, and I stood on the footpath outside, wondering how a man arrives at 65 to find his own son has decided he's already finished. I hadn't made it 20 steps down the street when I heard footsteps behind me. Raymond. I turned. It was a man I hadn't seen in perhaps 3 years, Graham Thorne, who had worked with me for nearly a decade at infrastructure before leaving to set up his own civil engineering consultancy. He was a few years younger than me, well-built, the kind of man who still played Saturday morning cricket at 57. He had driven up from Sydney for the party. Graham, I said. I was inside, he said. I heard what happened. I'm fine. You don't have to be fine. He fell into step beside me. What I heard in there wasn't a family having a private conversation. That was a performance. I stopped walking. What do you mean? Graham looked back toward the RSL, then at me. About 6 weeks ago, Thomas called me, out of nowhere, asked whether I'd noticed any changes in you, whether I thought you were still sharp, whether you seemed, in his words, on top of your finances. I stared at him. I told him you were the sharpest person I'd worked with in 30 years, and that he should be proud of his father. I didn't think much more about it, but tonight, watching that wasn't a worried son checking on his dad. That was a setup. We stood there on the footpath in the autumn dark, the distant sound of the party still audible through the RSL's glass doors. I was 65 years old. I had built a career from nothing, raised a child alone, paid off a house, saved carefully, never borrowed money I couldn't return, and somewhere in the last year or two, without me noticing the direction things were drifting, my son and his wife had begun to construct a version of me confused, incapable, declining that would justify what they wanted. The house, I said. What's the property worth now? Graham asked quietly. Last valuation was around $940,000. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then, come, have a coffee with me. There's something I want to show you. We went to a late-night cafe on the main street. Graham opened his phone and pulled up a series of emails forwarded from a mutual contact who worked in property conveyancing in Bowral. The emails were from Diane. They were dated 8 months earlier. They were addressed to a real estate agent and referenced a property in Moss Vale. 4 bedrooms, large garden, original owner. The emails discussed timeline. They discussed expected market value. They discussed, and this is the part that made my hands go still on the table, the management challenges associated with an elderly sole occupant who might resist the sale process. Elderly. I was 64 when those emails were sent. I read them twice. Then I put the phone down on the table and looked out through the cafe window at the empty street. How long have you had these? I asked. 3 weeks. My contact wasn't sure what to do. Neither was I, honestly. I didn't want to upset you with something that might amount to nothing. But after tonight, it's not nothing. No, Graham said. It's not. Over the next 3 days, I did very little except think. I went for long walks along the bush track behind my house. I sat in the garden that Diane had described as unmanageable, and I pulled weeds, and I thought about Thomas, about who he had been as a child, as a teenager, as a young man. He had been a good boy, funny and stubborn and occasionally infuriating, but good. I thought about when that goodness had been replaced by whatever had been standing in the RSL club that night. And I thought about whether Diane had found a weakness in him that I'd failed to see, or whether the weakness had always been there and the right pressure had simply revealed it. On the 4th day, I called a solicitor. Not the one Thomas had apparently already consulted, my own, a woman named Patricia Galveston, who had handled Margaret's estate and who I'd trusted for 20 years. I told her everything. I brought the forwarded emails Graham had shared. I brought my own bank records, my current will, my superannuation documents, every piece of paper that documented my financial standing. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Raymond, she said, you are in full legal control of your affairs. You have been, and you remain so. What your son and daughter-in-law have been doing is building a narrative. They haven't yet acted on it legally, but the intention is clear. What we need to do is make sure that if they attempt anything, a guardianship application, a contested will, any move toward power of attorney, we are so thoroughly prepared that it collapses on first contact. Can we do that? Easily, she said. You're healthy, cognitively sharp, financially competent, and you have documentation to prove it. We'll start with a formal capacity assessment, not because you need one, but because having it on record makes any challenge they bring almost impossible. She also said something that I have thought about many times since. This is more common than people realize, she said. It's sometimes called financial elder abuse, and it doesn't always come from strangers. Often, it comes from family. Often, it's dressed up as concern. The language of care can be the most effective cover for the language of control. The language of care as cover for control. I sat with that for a long time. Over the following 6 weeks, Patricia moved quietly and efficiently. I underwent the capacity assessment, full cognitive and financial competency evaluation at a clinic in Sydney. The results were, in the words of the assessing physician, well above average. For my age group, I updated my will, removed Thomas as sole executor, and appointed Dennis and Patricia jointly. I had my superannuation and investment accounts reviewed by a financial advisor and confirmed that nothing had been accessed or tampered with. They hadn't got that far yet. I also, during this period, had one conversation with Dennis that I hadn't expected to need. He drove down from Cairns on a Thursday. We sat in my kitchen with tea, and I showed him everything. The emails, the assessment, the new legal arrangements. He was very still while he read. When he finished, he looked up. Tom was always a bit weak for the wrong person, he said. It wasn't said with cruelty. It was said the way you say something you've observed for a long time and never found occasion to mention. I know, I said. Do you want to try and get through to him? I thought about it honestly. I want to give him the chance. But I won't do it on his timeline or Diane's. He comes to me. Dennis nodded. Fair enough. What I didn't know, couldn't have known at that point, was that the situation was already beginning to unravel from the inside. Graham, it turned out, had not been the only person Diane had contacted in her 6-month groundwork campaign. She had also reached out to a woman named Sandra Bourke, who had worked alongside me at infrastructure for 15 years. Sandra and I had always been friendly. She'd sent flowers when Margaret died, but we weren't close enough that I would have expected her name to appear in any of this. Diane had apparently reached out to her, asking whether Sandra had noticed any concerning behavior from me at work events or departmental functions in the year before my retirement. Sandra, who had more backbone than most people I've known, had told Diane politely but clearly that she'd observed no such thing, and had then, because she was Sandra, immediately called me to let me know. I didn't think much of it when she first called, Sandra told me. I assumed it was just a worried family member doing their due diligence, but she was very leading in how she asked. She wasn't really asking whether you were okay. She was fishing for material. When I told Patricia, she added Sandra's account to our file. They were building a case, Patricia said. They just didn't expect you to be building one too. It was Patricia who eventually initiated formal contact with Thomas and Diane. She sent a letter not threatening, not aggressive, but precise, outlining the legal documentation we had prepared, noting the emails regarding the property, noting the contact made to former colleagues, and advising that any further steps toward a guardianship application or unsolicited management of my affairs would be met with a formal response. I was not present when Thomas received that letter. I don't know exactly what the conversation between him and Diane was like in the hours after. What I know is that Thomas called me 9 days later. He didn't lead with an apology. He led with silence, about 30 seconds of it, which on a phone call is a long time. "Dad," he said. "Thomas." Another pause. "I don't know how we got here." "I think you do," I said. "I think if you sit quietly for long enough, you know exactly how you got here." He didn't argue with that. "Was it all Diane?" I asked. "Or did some part of you actually believe it, that I was losing it, that the house needed to go?" He took a long time to answer. I think I let myself believe it because it was easier than admitting what she wanted. And what did she want? Her parents are in debt. Badly. Her father had a business collapse. I didn't know how bad it was until last year. She needed a solution. And I think she looked around and saw my house. He didn't say anything. "Thomas," I said, "you are my son. You are the only child I have. I raised you alone, and I did not do it perfectly, but I did it with everything I had. And what happened at that party was not a lapse in judgment. That was a plan." "I know." His voice was very quiet. "I need you to understand something. The house is not going anywhere. My finances are not your concern unless I ask for your help. And the version of me that Diane built, confused, declining, incapable, that man does not exist. He never existed. I know, Dad. I'm not finished. I want a relationship with you. I want to know your children, but I will not have one with conditions attached. And I will not have one that includes pretending the last year didn't happen." He came to see me in person 2 weeks after that call. He came alone. We sat in the garden, the unmanageable garden, and he told me things about his marriage that I suspected but hadn't known. I told him things about myself, about what it had felt like standing on that footpath after leaving my own retirement party, that I hadn't told anyone except Dennis. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. You don't fix something like that in an afternoon. But we made a start. Diane did not come with him that day, or the next time, or the time after that. Thomas has told me things are strained. I don't know what their future holds, and that is not, ultimately, my business. What is my business is this. I am 65 years old. I live in my house in Moss Vale, with the big garden that I tend myself on Saturday mornings. I have my superannuation, my investments, my health. I have Dennis, who calls every Sunday. I have Graham, who drives up from Sydney occasionally, and we go to the cricket. I have Sandra, who sends Christmas cards and occasionally messages to make sure I haven't disappeared. I have Patricia, who I hope I never need again in a professional capacity but am glad to know. And I have, carefully, cautiously, a relationship with my son that is being rebuilt, one honest conversation at a time. I've learned some things in the past year that I didn't know before, I learned that love without boundaries isn't love, it's an open door. And some people will walk through it, carrying things you didn't invite in. I learned that the people most likely to describe you as incapable are sometimes the ones who need you to be. I learned that asking for help and being declared helpless are two very different things, and that the difference matters enormously. I learned that loneliness, real loneliness, is not about being alone. I have lived alone since Margaret passed, and I have not been lonely in the way I was lonely standing outside that RSL club, surrounded by people who had just watched my son decide I was finished. And I learned, perhaps most importantly, that the willingness to walk out of a room when what's happening in that room is wrong, to take your jacket and go, is not stubbornness. It is not pride. It is the knowledge that you have spent 65 years building something worth protecting, and that protecting it is not only allowed, it is necessary. If you are older, and someone in your family has begun speaking about your affairs in ways that feel like they're not really asking, document everything. Trust the people who knew you before this started. Get your own legal advice, not theirs. And remember that the language of concern can be the most convincing disguise that self-interest wears. If you are younger, and you recognize something of yourself in Thomas the slow drift, the rationalization, the small surrenders to someone else's version of events, it is not too late to find your way back. But the person you drifted away from will need more than an apology. They will need to see you choose differently, and then choose differently again, until it becomes the kind of choosing that doesn't need to be thought about anymore. The garden is looking good this year. The waratas Margaret planted along the back fence came up better than they have in a decade. Some mornings I sit out there with my tea before the day gets going, and I think about how close I came to losing all of it, not just the house, but the particular quiet of this place, the particular life I built here. Then I finish my tea, pull on my gloves, and get back to work.